Alright, let's freaking do this. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today it's time for Some Stuff I Missed, in which I go down some stuff I missed. Not all the stuff I missed, but some of it. Well, it appears I have let this roundup get a bit out of hand again, and I now have 25 more releases on the docket. I think only one of them not from 2021 this time. But this surprisingly came together more smoothly than a lot of previous volumes. I found a lot of quality here, and a bunch of the best stuff came from artists I'd never heard of. Even managed to fit the script in the same size Google Doc as the last volume where I only covered 18 projects. Don't know if that means anything regarding the video length, but whatever. Point is, I had fun with this one, and I hope you do too. If you want to see which tracks I'd mark as favorites and least favorites for specific projects, I have a document in Pastebin linked below, because they're not all gonna fit in the description. But yeah, here we go. May as well jump into it. Starting off with Feed Me, Feed Me. New studio album from Feed Me that sounds exactly like what you would expect it to sound like. It's cool, I guess. Honestly, found this thing to be pretty forgettable. Sure, all these modern dubstep and electro house grooves are exactly as hard-hitting and well-balanced as you'd hope for, and it is notable for being the most cohesive of his main studio albums so far. Calamari Tuesday and High Street Creeps were pretty all over the place and messy. This one seems much more focused. But that also means it's a lot less interesting to listen to. All these tracks are fun while they're on, but immediately disappear from my head once they're done. Even the vocal tracks, as nice as they sound, aren't quite hooky or catchy enough to stick with me. There are other cool moments, I guess. Tamp 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 may have had some kinda irritating chipmunk vocals, but enough propulsive groove and progression to feel pretty epic. Feather Crown was a nice celebratory closer with minor touches of Pachelbel's canon. Stupid Small Face may have been the single hardest hitting dubstep cut in the bunch here. And Frank Frazetta, well, at least I'm not gonna forget that one. But, I don't know, none of this really rises to among the best I've ever heard from him. Most of it feels like filler, and I wouldn't be able to tell a lot of these tracks apart from each other. It's a fun enough listen to generally get a pass from me. Feed Me is still doing the kind of stuff he does best, and will please all his fans and give them exactly what they want, but there's nothing absolutely essential here. So, I'm giving this a 6.5 out of 10. Next up, from Gabriel Lamar, Berlin Guitar. Pretty neat new little project from dub techno and down-tempo mainstay Gabriel Lamar. This one is obviously notable for being made out of a bunch of improvised jam sessions heavily utilizing an electric guitar. Gotta admit, that's a new one coming from this guy, and I was excited to get into this one purely thanks to the fact that there's a track on here called Trippin' with Ralph and Florian. That particular track perhaps unfortunately turned out not to stand out as among the track listing as much as its title did, but yeah, this was just as much fun as I hoped it would be. It is absolutely true that the inclusion of the guitars on this album is a total gimmick upon which Lamar is mostly just doing his usual thing, but hey, it's a well-implemented gimmick that had me invested from start to finish. He can both do up-tempo bangers like Grunewald or SO36, incorporate them into his usual acid techno formulas as seen on Cosmic Ride or No Closing Time. Really like the I Feel Love-esque bass line on the latter of those two. Or just deliver some really freaking nice laid-back tunes like on the above-mentioned Trippin' with Ralph and Florian, and especially Silly Love Song. The latter has to be my favorite cut in the bunch. The album definitely could benefit from some tightening up. There are quite a few cuts here, like Mitropa or 'Cause We're Lovers, that kind of just blend into everything around them and don't really stand out. But the grooves are always hard-hitting enough and the atmosphere enveloping enough where I don't mind sitting around and immersing myself in it a bit longer. I mean, I'm not gonna act like this is one of my new favorite projects from Lamar overall, or like I think this is an absolute must-listen. But the guitars give it a unique feel to it that no other album in his catalog, or really any other album off the top of my head, has. It'll definitely satisfy his fans and is an enjoyable enough experiment to be worth giving a shot. I'm feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on this. Oh, but while I'm on the topic of Gabriel Lamar, also from Gabriel Lamar, Into Sonic States. Yeah, this guy released 2 full albums in the span of just a few months, and unlike Berlin Guitar, which had a nice long lead-up with pre-album singles and everything, this one just dropped completely out of nowhere with 0 lead-up. Kinda had a feeling this wasn't going to be as much of a unique point of interest in his catalog as Berlin Guitar was. Basically geared myself up to hear just another Gabriel Llyr album, and yeah, that's pretty much what I got. I guess this one is more notable for having little to no actual techno on it, focusing a lot more on his downtempo and dub side of his sound, albeit to a lesser extent than, say, his 2017 album Flashin' On. There's still solid thumping grooves behind all these tracks, be it more dub-heavy on the minimalistic Highlight Caravan of Dub, or a few tracks like The Sound Behind the Mask or Quotes on The Wire that approach being techno bangers if they were at a slightly faster tempo. The latter of those two feels like a slowed down Psytrance cut. And there's a lot of tracks here that even feature guitars in a way that wouldn't have been out of place on Berlin Guitar, especially Unfinished Empathy. That one would have kicked ass on that album and manages to be one of the most striking and hard-hitting cuts despite being one of the slowest tempo ones. I also really enjoyed the triumphant 10-minute closer Remembering of Oneness. Those little Indian-sounding vocal interjections were a nice touch. But most of this is just going for his usual dubby and immersive blend that you typically expect out of him. Much of it just falls in the background without really catching my ear. For every standout here, there's a cut like Salvador Darlin, which leaves little to no impact on me. I can't really say Into Sonic State sticks out much in the grander scheme of his catalog. I don't think I'm going to be coming back to it much in the future. And Gabriel Llyr has no shortage of projects that sound just like this. But between the high points which could really stick with me and the general sonic variety on display, I can still say I came out of it satisfied enough for this to just barely get away with a solid 7 out of 10. It's pretty good. Next up from Modeselektor, Extended. I've known this German electro duo has existed for so many years, probably first heard their name sometime in high school, but I've never actually bothered to check these guys out until now. That is what these roundups are for, and I've gotten a couple of requests to cover them, so I threw them in here, and here's my thoughts on their previous 4 albums. Neat glitchy electro bangers, pretty good. Bigger, longer, and flashier redux of their debut featuring Thom Yorke on one track. It's cool, but I don't think the length is doing it any favors. A very middling commercialized take on their last album. These 3 tracks are good, the rest is skippable. I like the track Fentanyl, and the rest range from mediocre to bad. At least it's only about half hour. So I guess it turns out I'm not a huge fan of Modeselektor. I mean, I can commend them for having their own original sound, often gave me like Mr. Wazo and Ed Banger vibes despite being made out of the kind of entirely synth productions you'd expect out of like IDM artists. And there's all the mainstream hip-hop influences too. It's an interesting mix for sure, definitely get the appeal, and it does especially make sense to me that these guys were considered cutting edge at the time. Their particular approach to these simplistic synth productions still came off more contemporary and 2000 sounding instead of retro, hence the unfortunate genre tag the press gave them at the time, Eurocrunk. Oof. While they're not the most painfully dated stuff I've ever heard, they don't have any albums I would consider great. Their debut was their best, and that was only pretty good to me. Wasn't really going into this latest one with soaring expectations, especially since it had 27 tracks. Even if most of those tracks were like a minute or 2 long and the whole thing only added up to about an hour total. These guys' career arc has had a bit of a, like, Crystal Method-shaped downward trajectory, which hasn't exactly inspired excitement. So you can probably imagine my surprise when it turned out this latest album may have actually been my personal favorite of theirs to date. While all these ideas are in fact pretty scant and not super well developed individually, they're instead being built to directly flow into each other as part of one giant continuous mix, like their answer to something like a guy called Gerald's Proto-Acid The Berlin Sessions. It's not quite all coalescing into one singular groove in the same way that album is. The tracks on here do have more of a recognizable identity apart from each other, and it's easier to tell when they begin and end, even despite all the easy segues. Given the structuring of the album and sheer amount of tracks on display here, on top of the fact that this is the Some Stuff I Miss segment, this is not one that I feel like breaking down in depth on an individual track level. But know that each one does at least have something interesting to its name. A neat melodic progression, some banging beats or grooves, quite a few diversions into various genres ranging from hip-hop and trap to retro acid bangers, to Thomas Feldman-style dub techno, to ambient, to anything in between. And the pacing and constant progression kept most of the lower points from becoming an active turnoff. There was one misstep with that track with Paul St. Hilaire. The flow of the album seems to just stop dead when it gets to his part and takes a bit to pick up afterwards. Also wasn't huge on his creaky voice contributions here to begin with. But, I mean, the next lowest point was maybe something like Soda for having these kinda annoying stabby sawtooth leads that feel like a boneless version of Aphex Twin's 180dB, and even that one was alright. I'm not gonna say I think this album is properly great or fully had my attention from start to finish. There were a lot of moments that fell into the background, and I think its first half is markedly stronger than its second half. But I've always had a soft spot for projects structuring in free-flowing interconnected mixes like this, and it was a lot more fun and creative than I expected it to be. I might even hang on to it, guess we'll see what happens. This was a pleasant surprise. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up, from Hannah Peel, Fur Wave. Okay. These are the best kinds of projects to run into during the Some Stuff I Missed marathons. Once I saw this project show up in Deep Cut's mid-year list and I heard his description of it, an ambient record based on the ecological cycles of the Earth and built out of the work of legendary electronic pioneer Delia Derbyshire, I knew I absolutely had to listen to this one. I've not listened to any of Hannah Peel's other albums outside of this one. I know she's been at it for a while, like since 2010 or so, putting out various electronic projects, but didn't have time to browse through all that myself, so I just skipped to this. Let me know if you've heard any of her other stuff and there's some giant undiscovered gem that I might have missed. But anyway, I can more or less confirm the hype I've seen for this one. It's very much a project that emulates the styles of the synth pioneers of old. Not just Derbyshire, but also the likes of Tangerine Dream, Jean-Michel Jarre, maybe throw in Tonto's Expanding Headband if you like. A lot of the percussion textures did particularly remind me of Jarre's Oxygen, and she has produced this thing in such a way where it convincingly sounds like it could have come out in that era in like the mid-late 70s. But this album's melodies and general approach to its sound design does have just enough of its own identity to not feel like it's outright ripping these artists off or laying entirely within their shadows. She's doing her own thing with these styles. And it's freaking lovely across the board, just getting loads of expansive synth pads with deeply emotive chord progressions, lots of variety in synth textures, solid 70s synth pioneer percussion grooves, even some occasional extra instrumentation like wind instruments, fake choir voices, pianos, bassoons, and more. I suppose I do have minor issues from like a sequencing standpoint. While opener Wind Shadow does help set the right sort of mood to get you into the album, it does definitely feel like a slow start, especially when it's followed by a cut like Emergence in Nature, where it feels like a much stronger John Hopkins-ish groove is formed and I'm pulled in way more effectively. Also kinda wish the title track had been the closer. Those piano progressions at the end would have made for the perfect emotional kicker to close things out, while Reaction to Fusion's icier and groovier flares feel a bit more like an arbitrary pick for an ending. But these aren't make or break issues, and I don't want any of these tracks cut out, especially given how tight this thing is, only 35 minutes long. Whatever, even in its current form, I do legit see myself coming back to this one. And even if it doesn't end up on the year-end list proper, I can't deny the emotional power it packs in and how instantly I was pulled into its icy enveloping atmosphere. Definitely pick this one up if you've missed it yourself. I can overall give this a solid 8 out of 10. Next up from Leon Vynehall, Rare Forever.
Now we going to...
Now this one had me sorta excited since it outright topped Rick the Lie's mid-year list, and even though I haven't bothered to listen to any of Leon Vynehall's other work, he's an artist I've known existed for a minute thanks to his minor presence on Ninja Tune, but never really caught my interest before, I did feel like I ought to give this one a chance. Perhaps unfortunately though, this ended up not leaving nearly as much of an impression on me. I mean, I didn't dislike it, could definitely respect what it was doing. It's got a pretty neat mix of bouncy UK garage rhythms with some dub techno synth textures, and even some pretty neat inclusions of horns for that bit of organic texture. The whole thing gives me some pretty strong Floating Points vibes. Also not including the tracks that give me mild Burial vibes like Dumbo or Snakeskin Has Been. The expansive ambient moments like Exy Ego and Farewell Magnus Gabbro, or even the sprightly synth chords of An Exhale, which sounds like something out of Barker's Utility. You'd think this would be right up my usual alley, but I don't know, I don't really feel like there's much that Leon Vynehall offers that really sets himself apart from the crowd for me, either sonically or emotionally. There wasn't anything I didn't at least generally enjoy, but none of it was particularly memorable either. I've heard a lot of people say this really resonated with them emotionally. I can understand why enough to still give it my recommendation. Maybe it'll hit for you in the same way that Wayward album did for me earlier this year. But on a personal level, this album was just kind of there, and I'm probably not going to remember it exists. I'm overall feeling a 6.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Pendulum, Elemental EP. Yes, Pendulum are officially back. It's been over a decade since Immersion, and we've seen both the rise and the fall of the Knife Party side project in the interim. But they finally released this set of 4 tracks, breaking their long silence. And yeah, this EP is pretty good. Not amazing, but pretty good. I was a little worried back when they first released Driver, since that was basically just another copy of Slam and Salt in the Wounds. The most predictable possible way they could have returned. Though the intro with the sounds of someone coming out of the water was a nice nod to the end of Encoder. I did like Nothing for Free quite a bit more, it had a much better hook and kind of a more straightforward EDM drop like a Knife Party track might. And I did get much more excited when they dropped Come Alive, easily the strongest of the 4 tracks here, and kind of a more stomping metal-influenced track that doesn't sound like stuff they've already done before, if maybe falling a bit on the repetitive side. Louder Than Words with Hybrid Minds was pretty cool too, shows a bit of the return to the Hold Your Color sound, with Swire's voice going over this old school, smoother liquid drum and bass instrumental, although the hook here isn't as good as the others. I mean, on the whole, this EP is nothing incredible. None of these 4 tracks would rank among my favorites from them ever. But there's no outright duds here either. It's all a pretty fun listen. At the end of the day, while I don't see myself hanging on to this stuff long term, it's still great to finally have these guys back in the game after so many years. And say what you will about it, it's light years better than the Lost Souls EP. So yeah, I'll give it a solid 7 out of 10. Next up from Koreless, Agor. Now, this was an interesting one. Been getting a few requests to cover this, got some poking from Not Real Music to check it out too. Seen a fair bit of buzz surrounding it in general, and turns out I can confirm that buzz. I really like this thing. It's kind of a strange, half-ambient, sort of experimental electronic project that isn't really that experimental, but does bring names like Oneotrix Point Never and especially Clark to mind. Not too far away from the stuff they've been doing in the past 5 years or so, Death Peak, Curie Variations, Age of, Magic OPN. Little bits of all of those without going as far down the experimental rabbit hole or getting particularly abrasive. All these tracks have well-formed melodies and pulses, but not very much in the way of percussion. There's a bit here and there like on the track Joy Squad, but most of these mixes skip out on percussion entirely and end up giving me, I guess, mild Lorenzo Cini vibes as a result. If that guy's last album was actually good. It's a really interesting and engaging trip through all these semi-harsh but playful and dramatic synth rhythms with even quite a bit of female vocal interjections that add a little tinge of modern classical influence in there. Occasionally even getting a bit operatic when tracks like White Picket Fence or Frozen show up. And of course, for that extra bit of personal fan service, all 10 of these tracks link together in a continuous mix. There's a number of interludes here that work as something between transitional elements and experimental detours, and all add something of interest. And it all works together really well. Maybe not a project that gives me much to talk about or break down, but I did in fact have a lot of fun with it. I can see this getting some replay value later down the road. I enjoyed it quite a bit, think this can be a keeper. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Disclosure, Never Enough.
I want you.
You know, I did get excited when I saw that Disclosure put out a new EP, since they'd been killing it lately with the Ecstasy EP and the Energy album, and maybe even more so since I figured they saved their less commercial-sounding material to their EPs, as seen with Moonlight and Ecstasy again. But this newest EP was just kinda whatever. I mean, they deliver just as solid deep house grooves all over this thing as they always do, but none of these 5 tracks have enough texture or solid enough hooks to become distinct from each other beyond delivering the baseline expectation of what you'd want out of a Disclosure production. It all blends together and becomes background music for me. I suppose the title track and Happening came close to having a stronger hook, and Seduction had some fittingly smoother atmosphere that sounded like they were remixing some Wii System Settings theme or something. All of this was perfectly enjoyable while it was on and well produced as always, but it all immediately disappeared from my head when I was done. There's not a single moment from here that stands among the best work they've ever put out. Kind of a letdown, honestly. I'm overall feeling a solid 6 out of 10 on it. Next up, from Must Die, Crisis Vision. Alright, now here's one I'd been seeing getting some buzz. I admittedly don't have much of a long-running history with Must Die. I think I heard the Neo Tokyo EP once, like several years ago, and didn't really think anything of it at the time. Though previewing back through it now, it is noticeably better produced than a lot of modern dubstep was from that era. Haven't heard any of his other stuff, didn't feel like listening to his other album because I was rushing, also it has Datsik on it, and that guy's not worth my time. But I'd seen this new album of his cycling around and getting good reviews. I thought, what the heck, could always use a bit of modern dubstep in my life. Maybe this'll end up working better for me than Feed Me's mild letdown. And this even features Scream on one track for extra authenticity. That guy's like the OG of original classic dubstep. So I was curious about how it turned out, and after hearing it, is it weird that I kind of thought this was great? I didn't really know what to think of it on first listen, but on second listen I was like, all of this absolutely freaking slaps. First and foremost, it needs to be said that the main thing carrying this entire album is the production and mastering, which, again, is way better than what I'm used to out of this genre. Every sound, be it all the intense build-ups or the screamingly abrasive and industrial drops, feels absolutely monumental and huge. Even though I'm listening to this in my bedroom, it makes me feel like I'm being transported into a festival stadium that's like 60 feet high or something. Even when the drops feel like they come totally out of left field, everything still takes up such massive presence in the mix while still keeping everything so well balanced that it's legitimately impressive. I never expect dubstep producers to actually come off this intimidating. Usually when I hear about like death and destruction in this kind of music, it's just kind of cute. But here's like, whoa, this guy sounds like he means business. Not to say the edginess isn't still ridiculous sometimes, but the production does a lot of heavy lifting for it. Now, if this material was given to a more standard run-of-the-mill dubstep producer to mix and master, I might have found this thing insufferable in how damn edgelord-ish it was, and how frequently the drops don't match the energy of the build-ups. The most obvious example of the very fine line this album walks is Hellburst, which has all these bright and flashy melodic build-ups with even a little bit of like a Eurodance flavor, but it get totally obliterated by all these hardstyle kicks and stabbing noises, I guess, as the drop. It's such a giant tone shift that had the potential to be a giant buzzkill and really annoying. But the drop is so huge sounding, it feels like I've been abruptly transported into like a pitch black war zone or something, and the effect turns out to even border on frightening. Stuff like this might be why this whole thing needed a second listen for this to end up in great territory for me, so the drops wouldn't throw me off. On the other hand, there is one track on here, Delete It All, where the production was not enough to save it from the ridiculousness and edginess of the underlying composition. Hearing a chorus of what sounds like little kids repeatedly yelling, "Fuck the system! Fuck the rules!" No amount of mastering finesse could make that track not feel like a complete joke. But 1 dud out of 13 is pretty dang good. Doesn't take away from all the legit bangers here like the traditional modern dubstep of Lull OK, the retro acid flares of Lifesuck, and to a lesser extent Sorrowtech, the mildly poppier flares of Don't Even Bother and Error, the breakbeat tinges of Body Scream, the soul sampling on Nerve Damage, the slight techno-trance edges of Choose One, or the comparatively atmospheric closer Wherever You Go. Emphasis on comparatively. I can't imagine Crisis Vision is gonna be for everyone, and I have a feeling this is gonna be the kind of thing I'll need to be in a specific mood for than something I put on regularly, but I didn't expect it to work for me as much as it did, so I don't know. This is still definitely worth giving a shot. This was a ton of fun. I can hang on to this, and I'm giving it a solid 8 out of 10. Next up from Photay, On Hold. Okay, here we have the one entrant in this roundup still from last year. I put it on here because one of my regular commenters was calling it one of their favorite albums of 2021. I threw it in without looking it up, and then I looked it up, and I was like, wait a minute. I guess the physical LP did drop this year, I suppose. But yeah, whatever. I gave the album a shot anyway, since it did have a particularly interesting idea behind it, and I liked the album cover. Apparently, Photay made this album out of being put on hold for phone calls and recording and manipulating the hold music, and ended up with something sort of in the Tim Hecker vein of ambient music. Not as intense as what that guy does, but the hyper lo-fi recording fidelity implemented here does lead to a similar blocky production with occasional distortion artifacts. Though compositionally, this sounds a lot more like something you'd hear out of, say, Biosphere, just very low-key loops of melodic ambient pads with tons and tons of reverb. Occasionally a bit of interstitial voices in between with so much reverb and filtering you can't tell what they're saying, and it ends up working quite well for what it's going for. All these tracks pretty much just go for the same idea, so it's not really one I can break down further than that brief description. Maybe there were moments like Roaming that gave me mild vaporwave-ish vibes. There's some particularly haunting highlights like How May I Help You and Peak Bandwidth. The latter even started to give me a little bit of William Basinski vibes in how much its maybe orchestral sounds wavered so much, and even carrying into the following two cuts as well. Maybe wearing out its welcome a bit by March 10th, 1876, but I'm nitpicking. And I guess quite a few tracks, especially in the first half, do end in really abrupt hard cuts, which is a mild turnoff, but whatever. At the end of the day, this project is still very much engaging in that particular minimalistic ambient way, and I enjoyed it enough to purchase. Go check it out if this all sounds interesting to you. I can give this a 7.5 out of 10. Next up, from Basic Rhythm, Electronic Labyrinth. Basic Rhythm is an artist currently signed to Planet Mu. I saw this project in the new music section of iTunes under Electronic. I liked the album title and thought the cover looked cool, so I threw it in here. And I was not expecting one of the first things I'd hear when I hit play to be a bunch of chopped up samples of Kraftwerk's techno-pop. Yes, opening track Kraft basically isolated all the disparate percussion elements from that one Kraftwerk song and formed its own original rhythms with them, as well as adding in some synth voices pulled right out of their track Electric Cafe. That definitely got my attention right off the bat. And then it went into the mix of banging Detroit techno-style drum machines and fluttery woodwind samples of Hayward Road, followed by the Mr. Fingers-esque mix of smooth old-school deep house and acid flares, fittingly titled Acid Track. And I was like, okay, I think I may have a real undiscovered gem on my hands here. The rest of the album does similarly focus on different permutations of like traditional techno formulas and maybe can get repetitive, but not in a way that you wouldn't already expect out of this genre. You get like slightly jock jam hip hop tinged larking around, the heavy and metallic rhythms of the title track that have time for some atmospheric melodies in the back as well. You get a track called Techno, which lives up to its title, but also has quite a lot of progression over time and a lot of variety in its harsher rhythms. Segueing quite nicely into Palace of the Peacock and its occasional reverse drum beats going over these much more striking and ethereal synth flute loops, and finally closing out with the cascades of dramatic melody and field recordings of rain running through The Secret Ladder. There's no duds here to speak of, it's just really tight with these 8 tracks and all of them hit. Maybe a track or two could use a bit more development, maybe some tracks are more striking than others, but I was really impressed by this. If you're looking for some good old, no-nonsense traditional techno, Electronic Labyrinth delivers some of the best I've heard in this vein all year. This one's inevitably going to get overlooked, but it absolutely deserves more attention. I can overall give this a solid 8 out of 10. Next up from Violet Pony, Cutiemarks and the Things That Bind Us.
I messaged some bounty over Tumblr last night.
I don't think I ever in a million years would have expected to give a chance to a straight-up honest brony album, especially in the year of our Lord 2021, but Patricia Texan was recommending I check this one out, and I threw it onto this lineup purely out of curiosity. It would not be the most off-brand thing I've ever covered here before. I mean, I've never watched a single episode of My Little Pony or anything related to that fandom and don't have any plans to. All signs point towards that show not being my thing. Though having been a longtime YT-peer who peaked around 2013 and 2014, I did in fact have a lot of friends who were into it, so I know some general things about the show, I guess. Now, I've never covered albums like directly related to specific fandoms like this before. I think that kind of thing is best handled by those actually a part of the fandom, since that's obviously who this is meant to appeal to. But I'd also heard this was getting buzz from people who weren't bronies to begin with and happened to resonate outside the core MLP fanbase, so maybe there'd be something for me here. And you know what, even though I have no plans to come back to this after putting this video up, I did actually generally enjoy this. I still don't feel like I'm properly equipped to talk about, like, the lyrics further in depth as someone who's never watched the show, but there is, like, an attempt to directly tie in some of the themes of the show to how they apply in real life, using the idea of Cutiemarks, exploring what they mean for someone's life purpose. And it feels like on some level Violet Pony went into this half expecting this to be picked up by people who could fall outside the MLP fandom, most notably seen on a track like Antinymph, which directly talks about how being a brony can be cringe to those around you, but fuck the naysayers, ignore the cynicism behind such a sentiment, and embrace the cringe things you love. And that is a legit great message I can get behind. Honestly, the fact that this entire album centers itself so much around MLP and its themes has nothing to do with my reasons for not really wanting to come back to this. It's more with the fact that this album, musically and stylistically, is such a complete scattershot mess. I suppose these tracks are somewhat tied together by Vylet Pony's own vocals, which are pretty solid across the board. She does bring that sense of, like, teenage melodrama to every track and tells it well and sounds good. But this thing just shoots off into so many different genres. From EDM, to pop rock, to folk, to ambient, to 100 gex style hyperpop, to even trap and Latin music. The latter two, as shown on Syndicate and Protagonist Syndrome respectively, did have me quite confused as to what the hell they were doing here. It does lead to a listening experience where for every track that I could get into, there was another that wasn't really my thing. The most straightforward EDM cuts generally went over the best. Any of the modern dubstep drops that get implemented were solid and made for really solid payoffs to their build-ups. Ataichophobia, or however you say that, was probably the best in that vein. And the Porter Robinson homage Harper did make me smile when it came up. Also surprised by how much I got into the pop rock cut, Bonnie. The 100 gex style tracks are a turn off for me, not because I think they're necessarily bad for what they're going for, but more because that particular style isn't really my bag. This album's most abrasive moments tend to have me itching for the skip button. I can respect how much raw emotion and anger is packed into a track like Isometrica, and especially thanks to it being aimed at someone calling whoever the protagonist of that track was a slur. But also, wow, did the intense sound of that track get to be too much for me to want to come back to it. It's also worth noting that this album has 19 tracks and runs on for like 75 minutes total. It should not surprise you to hear that this got to be pretty dang exhausting by the end. The experience may be best treated as like a Savant album where you pick and choose favorites instead of keeping the whole thing as one unbroken package. As a result, it's kinda hard to recommend to anyone who isn't going to relate to the subject matter, either the MLP stuff or the teenage melodrama stuff. I'm probably not coming back to this again, it was way too overstuffed and inconsistent for my liking, but I also can't deny it did have its fair share of solid moments I could get into. And regardless of what I think of it, I definitely get the appeal of a project like this and why it has been getting so much buzz and resonating so strongly with people, so I guess I'll split the difference and give this a 6.7 out of 10. If this sounds like the kind of thing you'd be into, then it most likely really will work for you. Next up, from Terrence Dixon, reporting from Detroit. I need to give a shout out to Detroit techno and minimal techno legend Terrence Dixon. This guy's been at it since the mid-90s, and I've known about him for a minute. I first heard about him through that one album he did with Thomas Fellman. I've heard that and maybe a loose track or two, but I feel like I needed to do my due diligence and listen to at least one of his solo albums in full. And when I saw this one circulating, I figured, I may as well throw it on here. I haven't bothered to go through his greater back catalog, though the bits I have heard made his style out to sound like a more out there Jeff Mills or Drexcia, which seems fitting, Detroit techno. And this particular album seemed as representative of his usual sound as any. I think this album could act as like a pseudo-sequel to the album he released in 2014, also on the Rush Hour label, but under the name Population 1, called Theater of a Confused Mind. The album covers of those two projects are really similar. Though I suppose that could be a coincidence for all I know, I don't know. For what it's worth, I did also hear that album and actually enjoyed it more than this one, a bit better fleshed out and a tad more accessible in its sound, though this one is also shorter and easier to get through. But yeah, reporting from Detroit is a pretty neat collection of no-nonsense Detroit techno. You're not going to get anything you haven't heard before if you're familiar with this genre and scene, but it's all as well crafted and mysterious sounding as you'd hope. Standard sets of hypnotic grooves and disorienting melodies that bounce around the mix I definitely had fun with. Not all of these 8 tracks are winners. On 7 Mile All Night kicks the album off on a bit of a dull note, and Eighth Chance also fell on the uninteresting side. But when this album does hit, it really hits. Be it the spacey melodies of Beautiful Jerusalem, or the more propulsive, ear-catching grooves of Dexter and Joy at Night and the title track. The latter two really pulled me in right from the moment they first started. Also saving time for some more interesting moments like Music Box, which start with this tribal beat and pile on all these marching 909s and spooky melodies for some particularly haunting and otherworldly effect, even further intensified by the much more low-key and dissonant closer, Star Garden. Now, aside from the track resolution, which does have quite a bit of evolution over time, most of these tracks just stick to their core grooves and don't develop much beyond their initial ideas. But like I mentioned when I was talking about that basic rhythm project, this structuring is pretty much to be expected out of this particular genre. It certainly isn't repetitive to a bothersome degree. Obviously can't speak to how good of a starting point it is to Dixon's own work. I can say it is rather scant and doesn't offer anything that really swept me off my feet. I have a feeling it's not going to go down as a classic or anything. But I still had fun with it. I can generally give my thumbs up to it and say it's worth giving a shot if you're curious. I can give it a 7.3 out of 10. Next up from Flying Lotus, Yasuke. Alright, got a new soundtrack album from the one and only Flying Lotus. I have not seen the anime these compositions come from, though I've heard a lot of good things about it. I probably should watch it at some point. Thankfully, you don't need to see the show to enjoy this album. Honestly, this stuff could go toe-to-toe with some of his main albums. It's not far behind on what he did on Flamagra, and honestly, I could see it working even better than that project for some people. Now, as one of the people who still really likes Flamagra, more than most people seem to, I wouldn't say this is better for me personally. I think all the various guests he brought to the table and ideas he had display on that album were a lot more distinct and individually memorable than those on here, and are more likely to stick with me. But this project does have, like, thicker and obviously more soundtrack-ready production values, mixing old-school Vangelis-style progressive synths with orchestras, choirs, various Asian instrumentation like taikos and that kind of thing, and even some occasional hip-hop beats and trap beats. And it sounds absolutely freaking gorgeous from start to finish. I might even say it's more emotionally resonant than Flamagra. And even if there's a ton of tracks that often end in, like, super abrupt hard cuts and the whole thing doesn't flow nearly as seamlessly as his main albums would, there are still enough occasional segues between tracks and an overarching vibe created by the whole thing that, it could theoretically work as a main album if you like. I obviously don't feel like breaking down the 26 tracks on here, but all of them, despite their very short lengths, do all deliver interesting ideas that are all really investing. And he brings plenty of variety as well, even brings in a couple of quick little guest vocal performances from Thundercat, of course, and Nikki Randa and Denzel Curry. The vocal cuts that begin and end the album, which I'm guessing are the OP and ED themes, were much higher points for me than the other two in the middle. Denzel Curry's appearance was just kind of whatever. But there's still definitely a lot to enjoy here for any Flylo fan. I can co-sign this whole thing as being worth giving a shot. This gets a strong 7.5 out of 10 for me. Next up, from Hartnoll and Young, The Virus Diaries.
It's after 4:30, there's no one around.
Not gonna lie, I think this might mark the first ever time I've actively dreaded going into any orbital-related project. Yes, Paul Hartnoll has seen fit to release an entire album in collaboration with poet Murray Lachlan Young, meant to poke fun at the COVID-19 pandemic and all the chaos that came out of it affecting everyone's personal lives over the entire past year and a half. I did hear their first single called I'm Going Shopping way back in summer 2020 in the height of the chaos. And while I suppose I thought Young's spoken word performances going over Paul's early 90s acid techno pastiches did give off some pretty strong Yellow vibes, which was neat. I mean, it was a track about trying to social distance while grocery shopping. I don't need a song about that. I still bothered to listen to this entire project because I am such a big Orbital fan and completionist, but my thoughts on that one single echo throughout this entire project. How much you're able to get into this depends on how much you like the core premise, and I do not. I mean, I don't think either Hartnoll or Young failed in what they were attempting to make. Paul providing lots of retro dance beats as backdrops for Young's streams of consciousness while doing various things in quarantine, like buying stuff online, or drinking crappy coffee, or really wishing he could get a haircut, or absolutely failing to meditate, or reading conspiracy theories about how Hitler died in 1963. Young, through his creaky Dieter Meyer-esque spoken word, to successfully come across as some average dude going through everything everyone went through during quarantine. It is an accurate portrayal of what it was like, but none of Young's attempts at humor got me to even really crack a smile, even if I can tell they both think this stuff is a lot funnier than it is. And the same question has to come up, is it worth it to relive all the most annoying parts of the pandemic for this? I suppose I like the tracks Smile and Homeschooling for their uses of vocoders and containing more of a tune, also having less on-the-nose relation to quarantine shenanigans. Paul's beats aren't particularly attention-grabbing, but he does occasionally throw in mildly creative sound effect flips into the beats, like on I've Got a Delivery Coming and I Need a Haircut, that directly relate to what Young is talking about. The latter did probably have the most interesting sounding beat with the scissors and more organic textures. But also ideas like these sometimes work against the album, like on I've Been a Little Up and Down, where Paul slowly changes up the beat from the retro acid techno into this crazy circus show beat with trumpets like hoo hoo ha ha. Get it? Because this song's about going nuts in quarantine. I mean, this probably won't be as painful to listen like a decade from now when this bizarre moment in history is actually in history and could be interesting in that insta-dated time capsule sort of way. But even if the subject matter wasn't the freaking pandemic, this still would have been a derivative novelty that gets most of its appeal from sounding kinda like Yellow and goes no deeper than that. I don't resent the fact that Paul kind of phoned it in, since this was meant to be like a one-off novelty goof meant for the two of them to unwind a bit. I'm glad they had fun with it, but actually listening to it is just 40 minutes of cringe, and I'm overall feeling a 3.7 out of 10 on this. Next up from Naked Flames, 247365. Now here's a little undiscovered gem I came across in an album roundup from Liam the Music Reviewer. Go sub to that guy if you haven't already. This is a quick little 6-track house or trance thing with super lo-fi production that sounds like it belongs in the soundtrack for like a Super Monkey Ball game or something. Super smooth grooves with spacious melodic synths and tight bass lines. The bass lines are especially great. Also including various samples thrown in the background, including sound effects from Smash Bros. Brawl, Mario Kart Wii, Windows XP 3D Pinball. I think I heard a snippet from Zelda CDI at one point. Everything moving at really fast, like 160 BPM tempos. There's not really anything to break down from a track-by-track basis. All 6 tracks basically just blend together into the same groove as if the 6 tracks were almost one single track. I suppose it does kinda lose steam near the end with those 8-minute tracks kinda dragging on a bit for their own good, especially the closer Tobias, which is separated from the other tracks by Rinse-Off's Fade Out. But it's not to like a massively bothersome degree. And I did mention that it had super lo-fi production. The entire thing is filtered to sound like a 240p YouTube rip or something. But that does oddly kinda add to the nostalgic vibe it's going for. There's not really much else to say. If you just want a 39-minute pure adrenaline rush with early 2000s video game nostalgia and mood-brightening melodic sentimentality that requires absolutely zero brain usage, Naked Flames will provide you with that. I can hang on to this. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Gaspard Auge, Escapades. Alright, next up we got this side offering from One Half of Justice, which I'd gotten a request or two to cover. I'd heard he was going to be making a big tribute to 70s progressive synth with this album. I had to check it out of curiosity, and yeah, I thought it was cool. It sounds like what you would think One Half of Justice doing a tribute to the Jean-Michel Jarres of the world would sound like. It's big, imposing, epic sounding, lots of shiny metallic synths and thick French house bass lines, pretty similar to the instrumental cuts on Woman. It's definitely not the most interesting stuff I've ever heard in this mold, and I don't think I enjoyed it enough where I see myself hanging on to it, but it was cool for the one listen I gave it. There were a couple of duds. I thought Pentacle sounded like really generic synthwave. Lacrimosa's drum sounded super weak and stock MIDI sounding, even if I really like that one flute riff. Captain's goofy major key melodies felt pretty out of place and gave me a knee-jerk "no thanks" reaction. And Reverie was a really disjointed and underwhelming finish to this thing that lacked the sentimentality that it was going for. But I will not deny there are quite a few legit bangers on here. Force Majeure is an excellent attention-grabbing opener that pulled me in like any Justice album opener could. The grooves on Rocambole and Hey were freaking unstoppable. Europa feels like a more intense and dramatic version of a cut from M83's Digital Shades Volume 2. And I mean that as a compliment, I still really like that album. And even if this thing markedly loses steam in its second half, there are still a couple of highlights left up its sleeve in that leg too, like Belladone and Vox. Even if the former has long sections that constantly loop through these like musical phrases that seem like they're about to resolve to some other chord but never do, and feel like a tease. And the latter is a pretty unappealing first 20 seconds. But both are still major bangers and highlights regardless of my issues. This entire project does have the feel of like an old 70s sci-fi B-movie soundtrack. There's no hint of subtlety anywhere. The majority of these tracks sound very similar to each other, don't deliver much in the way of memorable hooks, and from a personal enjoyment level, it is ridiculously inconsistent, but hey, if you were really feeling the drought of New Justice material and feel like you'd be in the mood for one half of the duo basically doing a fake 70s soundtrack album, it's probably going to be as fun a listen as you'd expect. Nothing essential, but it's got its moments, like a 6.7 out of 10, I guess. Next up from Elucidian, Inwards. Elucidian is the experimental side project of progressive house producer Shifo. She's been putting out singles and EPs under this name for a few years now, about as long as I've been covering her music. Though I guess this is becoming more of her main thing now. A few months ago, she announced that she was burnt out on making music as Shifo, and released what she called her final single, Disappear, which was one of the best tracks she'd made to date, by the way. Had a lot of interesting progressions and epic moments, almost like a full EP's worth of material in one track. It was great. But just the other day, she released her debut album as Elucidian here, channeling a lot of her darkest thoughts, and half inspired by her recent fascination with the music of Nine Inch Nails, among other things. Well, it's admittedly only barely an album, only 6 tracks over 27 minutes total, but it is the most well-fleshed-out release she's put out under this name. Pretty neat collection of dark ambient and minimal industrial techno stuff, I guess. You get a few shifting minimal techno cuts like Defect and Uncover that give me later period Monolake vibes, the various whooshing effects and abstract beats of Opener Eclipse, the slow-building minimalistic melodies of Dream that continue to intensify and increase in tempo, and the title track, which just provides one empty space of creepy ambience. Oh yeah, and the bouncier beats of Crash, which have one pretty nice change up halfway through. I think that was my favorite moment here. It's all very low-key, reserved stuff. Once again, gives me similar vibes to that of, like, Monolake's Ghosts and VLSI album specifically. Though, honestly, it left me feeling like she could go even further with these ideas than she already has. Build on this material more, get even more twisted or abstract with the sound design, or even more abrasive, I don't know. She may have described this as an unpleasant album, but it's really not that unpleasant. I mean, sure, there's very little in the way of melody, and the whole thing does have an enveloping, mildly creepy atmosphere, but it's still all pretty easy on the ears, maybe even kinda relaxing in this low-key brooding. And obviously there's nothing wrong with that. I can certainly always find a place for this kind of material in my life, but this doesn't feel like a culmination of what she's explored under this name. It still feels like something that could be even more compelling later down the line with further refinement, but isn't fully formed yet. Whatever, I did still generally enjoy this thing, just more interested to see where she can take these ideas next if she so chooses to. I am overall feeling a 6.7 out of 10 on this, I guess. Next up from Sedibus, The Heavens. New side offering from The Orb here. We got a one-off collab between Alex Patterson and Andy Falconer, the latter of whom is behind the ever-classic Orb track Into the Fourth Dimension. Obviously, given the fact that it ended up here instead of getting its own video meant I didn't really have much to say about it. Though I thought it was quite nice, this very expansive-sounding, space-themed ambient project consisting of 4 tracks running on anywhere from 9 to 18 minutes. Kinda reminds me of Moonbuilding 2703 AD in that way. That said, this album isn't as consistently engaging, interesting, or well-detailed as that one. I do like the constant progression of Toy 1338B, but didn't find any of his various sections to be all that riveting on their own. That one bit with the sample saying Sputnik even kind of felt a bit corny and on the nose. And the closer Papillons just kind of dragged on and lost my attention like halfway through. But I really like the dramatic piano-centric tones of Afterlife Aftershave, and the 18-minute track Unknowable was by far the strongest cut of all of them. That track was kind of like a cross between a cut from Moonbuilding and some of the more emotional pieces from the back half of No Sounds Are Out of Bounds. The way it builds up with 5 minutes of gorgeous piano and ambience, and then slowly opens up with this sort of reggaetonish beat, and then continually evolving and sticking to its core groove. It's a fantastic trip that makes great use of its length and makes the album worth the experience on its own. Just, kind of wish the rest of the album could hit that kind of height. I mean, I'm probably not gonna hang on to this longer term, but I guess its highest points were high enough where I can just barely let it get away with a solid 7 out of 10. It's cool. Next up from Ace Aura, Gem World EP. I mainly threw this on here out of curiosity since Landon Remixes is this guy's manager, and I've seen him show up on my Twitter timeline on the regular as a result. But turns out I actually thought this was a pretty solid little slice of EDM and modern rhythm dubstep or whatever you call it these days. I quite enjoyed it. The whole thing's really well produced. A lot of these build-ups have this really spacious and borderline orchestral vibe to them, and the drops all feel like satisfying and hard-hitting payoffs. Everything's really well detailed. I suppose the rougher tones of Closer Inferno weren't as engaging as the way this thing started, but all the other 3 tracks are really solid. The title track has a super neat sounding intro with all those bell sounds and one particularly kick-ass drop. Probably my favorite cut here overall. Soul Cavern's intro with the pitched up vocals I wasn't huge on, but quickly picks up, and that second drop where it molds those giant stabs into the more standard progressive house beat was excellent. And while the vocal appearance from Nitrix on Shattered isn't anything especially to write home about, the skittery drops on that one were a lot of fun too. I mean, this EP is nothing especially innovative or out of the box, but it is all really solid for what it's going for. Can definitely co-sign this. If this style happens to be your thing, then give it a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Daniel Avery, Together in Static. It's true that I covered this guy's debut album Drone Logic back in volume 3 of these roundups, though I felt like going back through the rest of his catalog to solidify my thoughts, since his debut was the only one I'd actually heard in full. You want my thoughts on his debut, you can check out that old segment. I still stand by everything I said there. And having heard his other albums now, I can now definitively confirm the general buzz that Drone Logic is also still his best and most interesting work. Song for Alpha, after hearing it up close, does in fact have a much better command of space than its predecessor, and a handful of really solid moments, but it's much shorter on ideas and even more derivative, much more specifically indebted to 90s ambient techno, artificial intelligence era IDM, and especially earlier Sheet 1 era Plastic Man. Love and Light was an album billed as having 2 distinct halves, the first half of which was more stuff like Song for Alpha, and the second half was a bunch of Boards of Canada pastiches. And honestly, the 2 halves weren't really that distinct. I mean, I'll admit both were more enjoyable than what I expected out of their surrounding buzz. They're perfectly serviceable IDM background music, and will fulfill the hunger of any minimal ambient techno fans, but nothing I heard really builds upon or rises above their very obvious influences. And then there's this latest one, Together in Static, which seems to have had hardly any buzz at all. And yeah, that kind of scans, as this is his least essential project yet. It's just more stuff like his last 2 albums. Just more very run-of-the-mill ambient techno with even less structure or cohesion than before. I mean, there's a few moments in the back half that pull me in a bit more, like A Life That Is Your Own brought in some pianos at one point, which was neat. Endless Hours combined some industrial techno with warm melodic pads to pretty neat emotional effect. And Hazel and Gold stands as the strongest cut in the bunch by a long shot, as there was noticeably more effort put into the sound design and synth timbres. All those bell-like tones actually made it stand out from the crowd. But the rest of this is just whatever. Just more whooshing industrial techno and generic melodic EDM that even he's done better, despite some decent melodies. And a few really forgettable ambient cuts as well, most of which are interludes aside from the opener, which despite being the longest cut in the bunch somehow has the least development. I mean, this isn't like offensive or anything, but as someone who's heard so freaking much material that sounds exactly like this over the years, I find it kinda hard to recommend as anything especially worth going out of your way for. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm overall feeling like a 5.7 out of 10 on this. Next up, from Nashville Ambient Ensemble, Cerulean. I've seen Mark from Spectrum Pulse recommend this one a few times on Twitter, and the premise alone was too interesting for me to want to pass up, so in the mood for an ambient country crossover? Nashville Ambient Ensemble is a collective that is exactly what it says on the tin, spearheaded by electronic composer Michael Hicks and featuring several other instrumentalists and songwriters from the Nashville area. The result is an expansive sounding mix of ambient synths and extremely light electronic percussion, mixing with lots more organic instrumentation like guitars, pedal steel, piano, and the airy vocals of Deli Paloma Sisk. Creating 6 extended semi-improvisational cuts that just kind of meander wherever they like, but mostly aim to create this very pleasant, new age-ish vibe. And it doesn't feel like a novelty for its own sake. The mix is a lot less weird than the band name makes it sound. The KLF's Madrugada Eterna proved that steel guitar and synth can work great together in ambient music. And despite the much more new agey feel to this thing, as I mentioned, it doesn't feel cheesy either. These elements all work really well together and have a lot of emotionality behind them. Especially when the more melancholy cuts like Elegy, Conversion, or the title track show up and end up creating a more mysterious but still heartfelt vibe. I guess it's more new age in like maybe the Andreas Vollenweider sense, where you got a lot of different instrumentation coming together in a way you wouldn't necessarily expect, but still ending up really emotionally resonant in spite of it. Maybe not nearly to the same extent, but hey, that minor parallel is only a compliment. Now, these 6 compositions aren't the most memorable in their own right and can maybe run together a bit, as you'd guess with this kind of improvisational structure. I don't know if I was so enamored by what I was hearing that it's going to end up as like a favorite of the year or anything, but I did enjoy it enough to purchase and hang on to. It is a very easy and accessible listen, good for like watching sunsets to or something. Definitely worth giving a shot if it sounds like it'd be up your alley. I can give it a 7.5 out of 10. But while we're on the topic of undiscovered ambient gems, next up from Llyr, Biome. Here's another gem coming out of the Mesh label that also gave us Rob Clouth and Reed Willis. We got this artist, real name Gareth Williams, hailing from Berlin, who's got a pretty interesting environmental-themed ambient techno project. The concept behind this project is really cool all on its own. Williams has seen fit to split this 8-track album into 2 halves. The first half, titled Pre-Anthropocene, shows a load of expansive ambient compositions meant, in his words, as an abstract meditation on the marvels of nature. And the second half, Anthropocene, features a bunch of more industrial-leaning ambient techno cuts that, of course, symbolize how humankind has interfered on these natural landscapes. Both halves making use of lots of field recordings from the forests of Borneo, and the first half in particular utilizing only said recordings and manipulations thereof. I mean, it's not subtle about its message, but it approaches it in a really consistently engaging way that is super well produced and sonically detailed as you'd hope for. It's fascinating just to read about his creative process behind this project, like how he manipulated frog calls to create the bubbly ambience of courtship signal, or how the Hawthorne effect was inspired from when he was recording a swarm of insects that ended up surrounding him specifically, and naming the resulting track after the psychological effect in which just the knowledge that humans are around and observing you can change your behavior. And these 2 cuts aren't even 2 of the bigger highlights in my opinion. I was even more pulled into the shifting and evolving varied ambient sound design on tracks like Refuge of Majesty and Winged Chamber Music, or the slightly more tuneful and epic sounding techno cuts like Intrusion No. 509 or Encroachment. And there's not a single weak track in the bunch or anything that feels like filler. Even other non-highlights like the immersive and relaxing ambient pad of Chorus of the Insects, and the Monolake-esque groove of Interject featuring a collaboration with minimal techno outfit Private Agenda, give me plenty to enjoy too. I couldn't bring myself to like pick a least favorite cut on here, and it's super tight at only 45 minutes total. There's no filler to be found here. There is definitely a part of me who wanted even more out of this material, wouldn't mind at least an extra track or 2 on either side, but it's certainly not underdeveloped. This album isn't as tuneful as either 0 Point or Mother of. There's not a lot in the way of strong melodies or anything like that, but it's not really trying for that either. The sound design and concept are enough to carry this thing on their own, and honestly I still found it to be a more accessible listen than the latter of those 2. This one definitely deserves more attention than it's getting. Go check it out. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10 on it. And to finish off, we got Sweet Trip, A Tiny House in Secret Speeches, Polar Equals. And we're closing this roundup out with a project from a band I've gotten lots of requests to cover over many years. They do admittedly like sit on the fringe of electronic music, kind of more on the shoegaze and experimental rock end of things, but if I can count M83 as electronic, then these guys can count too. I actually hadn't listened to any of their projects prior to this roundup, despite knowing they've existed since like 2015 or so. So I made sure to catch myself up on their previous 3 albums. Their debut, Halika, from 1998, isn't too far away from that Nashville Ambient Ensemble project I just got done talking about. A very monolithic but very pleasant wall of synths, guitars, airy vocals, and banging percussion. Very solid and emotionally resonant, if slightly one-note ambient record. Velocity Design Comfort from 2003 is the one that everyone always recommends to me and asks me to talk about. And it's one that I'll feel like I'll probably need to hang on longer to grow on me, but I definitely understood right away how it got so hyped up. It feels like a mix of the kind of electronic rock and distortion-heavy shoegaze stuff M83 were exploring around the time, combined with hyper-glitchy and noisy IDM like early Square Pusher minus the structure, and a nice healthy dose of Stereolab pop rock sheen for good measure. Definitely a unique mix of sounds and influences there. Now, also like most Stereolab albums, this thing did run on really long. Not sure if it fully justifies being 73 minutes, but yeah, still definitely got the hype behind this one and we'll hang on to it. And while I'm on the topic of Stereolab, they wore that influence on their sleeve even more on their 3rd album, You Will Never Know Why, in 2009, which was more of a turn for indie pop rock in the Mars Audiac Quintet sort of mold, which is not a complaint. They had the moody tunes to back themselves up and still retained enough of their own identity to not feel like complete rip-offs, even if the listening experience is less interesting than either Mars Audiac Quintet or just their previous project. But yeah, that album was 12 years ago. From what I understand, these guys never got much traction back when they were still active, but they developed a lot more of a cult following in more recent years. And they gained enough popular interest for the band to decide to come back and make this 4th album here. And yeah, it's definitely a new Sweet Trip album. This latest one is basically just a mix of their previous 2 albums, combining the expansive experimentalism found on Velocity Design Comfort with some of the more indie pop tunefulness of You Will Never Know Why. There's really not much in the way of new ideas they haven't already done before. Seems mostly concerned with pleasing the fans who just want more of the same, which honestly isn't too surprising given how long it's been. But I actually think I like this more than You Will Never Know Why. Where that album kinda ran together for me, I feel like this one's got more textural variety and allows its tracks to more easily stand apart from each other. Though at the same time, melodically and chord progression-wise, they're pretty much cut from the exact same cloth. I feel like if you've listened to You Will Never Know Why a lot, you're gonna run into a lot of deja vu here. Though I guess that kind of applies to all their albums. They do have a very distinct way of putting together melodies and chord progressions. Still, lack of originality aside, if you just want some solid shoegaze-y dream pop, Sweet Trip definitely deliver plenty of that. There are a lot of really solid cuts all over this. Tiny houses and chapters are really punchy with lots of excitingly unpredictable progressions. Surviving a Smile, Walkers Beware, and In Sound We Found Each Other have particularly strong and catchy tunes behind them. The latter was a particular favorite. There's space for plenty of interesting diversions like the low-key ballads of This Rain Is Comfort and Come Stay the Night, or the abstract synthwave of Randfilt, or the insane glitch fest at the end of You. And this thing ends really strongly with the rapidly shifting polar equals and the climactic post-rock of At Last a Truth That Is Real. This whole thing is pretty well paced and varied. I surprisingly wasn't feeling the length on this one quite as much as I was on their last 2. Maybe I was a bit underwhelmed by some of the longer cuts like Eve Foolery Mill 5 not feeling as epic as they could. And again, there may be absolutely nothing here Sweet Trip haven't already done before, but I mean, they're doing what they were doing before roughly as well as they always did. It's gonna give the fans everything they would have wanted. I'm probably not gonna hang on to this myself, but I definitely enjoyed it enough to co-sign it like most other people have. Enough to get away with a 7.3 out of 10. And that's it. That's the end of the roundup. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.